Please select the English language from the bottom of the screen.
Okay.
Ready? Thank you very much.
Bueno, buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la conferencia Algoritmos de la Opresión, que es parte de las terceras jornadas de Comunicación Estratégica de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad Nacional de Lomas de Zamora. Mi nombre es Jimena, formo parte del equipo de docentes de Introducción a la Comunicación y estaré a cargo del encuentro de esta tarde. Les pedimos que mantengan sus micrófonos apagados durante la conferencia y que si llegan a tener problemas con el audio, apaguen la cámara o el Wi-Fi de otros dispositivos. Para esta conferencia en particular, tendrán que elegir el canal por el que desean escuchar, español o inglés. Pueden seleccionarlo a través del icono mundo que encuentran en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla.
Así me.
También allí pueden mutear el audio original si es que así lo desean. Aclaradas las cuestiones técnicas, agradecemos la presencia del decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, Magíster Gustavo Naón, y también la presencia de estudiantes, docentes y funcionarios de la casa, e invitados e invitadas de otras organizaciones del país e internacionales. Finalmente les comento que durante la charla les pasaremos un enlace para quienes deseen solicitar certificado de asistencia. Le cedo ahora la palabra a la moderadora de la charla, Soledad Reyes Manoso. Soledad es periodista y profesora de Comunicación Social, especialista en Educación y Nuevas Tecnologías por Flaxo, maestranda en Comunicación Digital Interactiva, docente de grado y posgrado e investigadora de la Universidad Nacional de Lomas de Zamora. Bienvenida, Soledad.
Muchas gracias, Jime. En esta tarde vamos a hablar de algoritmos, desigualdad, discriminación y sexismo. Los algoritmos, para explicarlo sencillo, podemos decir que son un conjunto de reglas, una serie de instrucciones o de pasos que se llevan a cabo para solucionar un problema y que han sido objeto de diversas investigaciones en los últimos años. Trabajos con una perspectiva crítica que ganan cada vez más, por suerte, terreno en el campo académico. Muchas veces prevalece un discurso instrumental de la tecnología, la idea de una tecnología neutral, que no es buena ni mala, pero no podemos dejar de discutir estas posturas para entender que toda tecnología es política. Estamos hablando de poner en discusión quiénes son los que escriben estos algoritmos y qué intereses tienen. Realmente es un placer poder recibir en esta casa a la doctora Safiya, experta en temas de discriminación algorítmica y sesgo tecnológico. Ella es profesora asociada en la Universidad de California, Los Ángeles, UCLA, en el Departamento de Estudios de la Información, donde se desempeña como cofundadora y codirectora del Centro de UCLA para la Investigación Crítica de Internet. Es investigadora asociada en el Oxford Institute de la Universidad de Oxford. Además es integrante de la Junta de Iniciativa por los Derechos Civiles Cibernéticos, que asesora a personas vulnerables en el acoso en línea. Es autora del libro Algoritmos de la Opresión, cómo los motores de búsqueda refuerzan el racismo, que aborda justamente el sesgo algorítmico racista y sexista en los motores de búsqueda comerciales. Las y los invito a escuchar la conferencia Algoritmos de la Opresión, a cargo de Safiya. Sin duda, hay mucho que hoy vamos a poder aprender sobre este nuevo entorno que habitamos y donde vemos que se reproducen las desigualdades. Safiya, adelante.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation to share with you. If someone would be willing to allow me to share my screen, I am happy to do so. I think I have to be made a co-host in order to do that. But I want to just say that it's such a pleasure to get to come and share my work with you today. And I hope that I can share some ideas that will kind of help us understand how we can think differently about a variety of different large technology companies and technologies that so many of us are increasingly reliant upon in the world. So let me just kind of quickly move through, and then I want to leave a few minutes for us to have some time for questions or conversation too. So the first thing I want to say is that, you know, it's really amazing that we are living in a time where the harms of different kinds of artificial intelligence and algorithms is being made visible. One of the ways that that's happening is that we're kind of entering an era where some of the things that were taken for granted in the past about the kind of liberatory possibilities of technology are actually being made visible by kind of the harms are being made visible by journalists and scholars, many of whom are people of color and LGBTQ scholars and journalists who are looking in different places around the world at the way in which different forms of algorithmic decision-making are being deployed. When I started looking at Google in particular about a decade ago, it was very, very difficult to get anyone to believe that technologies were dangerous in these ways to societies, to culture, to vulnerable people. And so I'll share a little bit with you about some of the early research that I did that I think has been part of this moment where now we can have organized conferences and meetings where we really are trying to apprehend the potential dangers of various kinds of automated decision-making technologies or kind of narrow artificial intelligence products and projects. Much of this work that I do is in the United States, and I have focused on women of color, Black women, Latina, and Asian women in the US context. But I think that if we look more broadly, globally, we will see some of these kinds of hierarchical damages and dangers that are predicated upon systems of oppression, of racism and sexism that extend far beyond the US borders. And so here's a few headlines that kind of signal that we are in this moment where some people are calling it in the Financial Times, for example, a techlash, or we're getting really important coverage about how these kind of systems are putting people in prison, implicated in people losing their children, being used at borders to determine who can cross borders, for example. And so it's really, as much as this is a terrible set of conversations that I think we'll be having today, that we are able to have them is really important, because again, a decade ago, to try to talk about these things would be for people to kind of respond and say, well, Safiya, you know, it's impossible for technology to discriminate because technology is really just software code, and software code is just math, and math can't be racist. So it's very reductionist kinds of logics that I think now we can dispense with, because unfortunately we have so much more evidence of the harms. I mentioned that there were many people of color, and these are just, you know, in the kind of in solidarity with the movement for Black lives that's happening in the United States and really around the world. I want you to know that there are so many Black scholars who have been writing about the harms of different kinds of technologies for a long time. These are just some of the ways in which people are talking about it, from the way that teenagers of color, for example, have been power users of technology, who are people we should be listening to and watching and learning from, all the way through to the way in which science and medicine and technologies of discrimination get deployed through technology and medicine. The whole history of software development, of course, in the work of Charlton McElwain here in his new book, Black Software, is very important because it's in these books and that these scholars are writing also that we see histories of resistance also and different kinds of possibilities, ways that we might have imagined some of these technologies to have been developed and where they were suppressed or where people were silenced and where their ideas were not funded or supported. There's obviously there's a number of women here who in particular who are really writing, and I think one of the things that we've learned from looking at what women researchers in this space are doing is that we are looking in places where we are more attuned to social harm in many cases around the world, where we are part of communities where we see the harm disproportionately deployed. And so this is another reason why it's so important for women in particular be at the table and as researchers, journalists, as organizers, and to be listened to because they quite frankly are seeing things. When I started writing about Google, there were not a lot of, well, there weren't any other Black women writing about Google. And of course, because of my own identity and experience as a Black American, I was looking in different places and I was seeing things that other people who were writing about Google were not looking at and were not seeing, quite frankly. And this is, again, I think a way to just affirm for us that our own identities, our own subjectivities, and especially listening to people who grow up and live in the margins in our society is so important because those contributions are different, quite frankly, and they're important voices to listen to. Just by way of adding that beyond talking about just Google, I have written about technology and the potential for harm in desensitizing the public, for example, to the humanity of people of color, to the humanity of oppressed people, and really thinking about what does it mean that systems are able to profit from the exploitation of vulnerable people. So again, looking at Google, but also looking beyond that. And so here's some other writings that I've done that might be of interest in this space too. There are a number of people that I want you to know about. And so we have, many of us in the United States, people of color have come together and formed a collective called the Critical Race and Digital Studies Center at New York University at NYU. We have a website. This is a screenshot of the website. Many times people ask me, like, what else should I be reading? And I would just point you to this syllabus where there are a lot of people, you know, Latinx, Black, Indigenous scholars who are writing about the digital and critically about race and oppression. So I think that you would potentially find a much broader set of arguments and people here in this group too. So let me kind of start with the first study that really was the anchor to the book, Algorithms of Oppression, but really it is probably the simplest and most basic part of the book that I tried to lead with, because I thought it was really the finding that was so obvious. And again, you know, you can see here that these search results are from 2011. From 2009 until about the fall of 2012, when you did a keyword search on the terms Black girls, you can see here.
Perdón, te interrumpo la conversación. Escuchamos a las dos intérpretes al mismo tiempo. We are listening to Safiya and the two translators at the same time.
I see. Am I going too fast?
We continue. Thank you.
All right. You can see here that these results are on just two simple keywords, the keywords Black girls. And yet almost all of the results that came for many years was pornography, or this kind of hypersexualized or sexually objectifying content. These were the results, and these were the ads that that came to the fore in Google. And of course, this still exists, unfortunately. When you look for Latina girls and Asian girls in the United States, you're more likely to get this kind of pornographic or hypersexualized types of results. And so the question that this opened for me in my research was, why is it that you don't have to add the word sex or pornography, but that women and girls of color are just synonymous with being sexually objectified in search engines like Google? And of course, what are the implications of this for girls of color, for example, who are not the majority in the population and don't have enough money or capital to use AdWords or the kind of Google advertising platform that makes these results visible? And so the whole book is really an unpacking of how search engines work. And of course, what does it mean for vulnerable people like children or teenagers or poor people who will never be able to kind of game an advertising system? Indeed, what this reveals is that Google search is an advertising platform. It's not the public library. It's not a knowledge epicenter. It's not reliable for meeting the public's everyday needs around knowledge. What it is good for is helping make Google's clients, or the people that pay the company to make their results visible, more visible. And of course, we are right now in the midst, the Department of Justice in the United States has just opened a lawsuit against Google a couple of weeks ago around anti-competitive business practices. One of the things that Google also does, in addition to just kind of misrepresenting people in these ways, which we know are very dangerous and harmful, right? This is part of the desensitizing or dehumanizing of women and girls in society that allows for a greater appetite or willingness to accept abuse toward them. So those of us who study media representations, for example, really understand how dangerous these kinds of stereotypes are in society, because they desensitize people to intervening on behalf of people who are vulnerable and children who are vulnerable. So I've written about these kinds of logics of what it means to have an advertising platform framed as a reliable knowledge arbiter. And I think these are the kinds of things that are worth exploring, especially when we talk about Google being exported as an American company with its own kind of hegemonic ideas about the world that its programmers program, and of course the way in which people all over the world come to be represented and misrepresented through the lens of Silicon Valley programmers. And of course, this is incredibly important to society. Now, these ideas about Black women and girls in particular is something that I try to really spend time unpacking in the book, which is that these mythologies about the hypersexualization of women and girls of color, especially Black girls in societies around the world, is used as a justification for abusing them. And so we know in the US, in North America and in South America, the kind of ways in which Black children get dehumanized has a very, very hundreds of years long history that coincides with, and in fact, emanates from the institution of slavery. It emanates from the transatlantic slave trade, right? It becomes a way to justify the abuse and mistreatment of African peoples around the world. That's what these stereotypes do. And so I spend a lot of time in the book trying to link something as seemingly benign as search results to these longer histories that we really have to understand so that we can contextualize why they're so damaging and why they're so dangerous in society. Now, other people have been writing and doing research about what happens in search engines. For example, when search engines misrepresent political candidates, right? Or make certain kinds of political candidates more visible than other kinds of candidates. And of course, people have argued that unregulated search engines actually have huge import in political campaigns all over the world, and that political campaigns with the most money are able to game search results in their favor. And of course, this then makes it very difficult for people who are running for office who are not backed by large corporations, who are not backed by dark money, to be visible and viable, especially in local elections and in kind of local politics. And of course, we have to think about these for all kinds of democratic and other types of political movements that are about more liberatory possibilities than far right-leaning political agendas. And so I think these are, again, reasons why we have to look at and interrogate what happens in search engines. We also have a whole host of bad actors, people that, in this case, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, people who are deeply committed to fascism and right-wing ideologies, who manipulate search engine results and spend an incredible amount of time and money and resource trying to upend the logics of search engines and the results, and trying to game their extremist views and racist views, quite frankly, to the first page of search. And when Google is asked about this in the past, they say to interfere in the search engine results that their algorithm produces would be bad technology practice. That's what they call it. But of course, what we know is that outside of the US context, for example, in Germany and France and throughout the EU, it is illegal to traffic in hate speech and anti-Semitism, and that kind of speech has to be taken down out of Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all kinds of platforms, eBay, Amazon. So the regulatory environment around how people are engaged with in harmful ways is very, very important. And of course, the EU has been out front in some of this, Germany and France in particular, but we're starting to put more of a serious lens on this in the United States as well. And of course, these are things that I really encourage everybody to be watching and paying attention to. What we in fact know is that the tech industry has spent the better part of 30 years trying to obfuscate and deny that they moderate content. And we have these important books behind the screen by Sarah Roberts, Ghost Work by Mary Gray, that show us the incredibly damaging labor that tech workers do in taking down harmful content. Indeed, they are profoundly psychologically, emotionally, neurologically harmed by the kind of work that they do in moderating content. And of course, this is a global practice with, moderation sites dispersed all over the world, particularly in kind of former colonies of the United States, and in places where there are these kind of neo-colonial relationships where adjudication takes place. I'll just quickly say that, one of the things I try to argue in the book is that social inequality is not going to be solved by our tapping on pieces of glass and hardware and by sending emails furiously. That is not the way we solve global social inequality. We are going to have to take seriously the trade policies that are being enacted among nations, the distribution of wealth and resources that through the kind of extractive technologies that are being kind of pushed on us. These are places where we've got to look at the kind of material consequences of technology and not just kind of the way we think of search as an ephemeral practice online. I mean, there are all kinds of global implications of the way in which these companies operate in the world. I've recently been writing about the loss of public goods and the kind of anti-democratic tendencies of big tech companies. And I wrote about this for Noema magazine, which is easy to find online, but there's more here about, again, the implications of the loss of democratic institutional counterweights. We are living through a moment with COVID-19 of profound health disparities, the fragility, the fragile nature of our public health and public media systems has been laid bare. And so it's so important that we understand that the only industry that is making trillions of dollars during this global crisis is the tech sector, which is rushing in with all kinds of tech solutions rather than the kinds of solutions that we need, which is we need the resources that they have offshored into their private accounts. We need the profits reinvested back into publics all over the world where they do business. We need the taxes that they don't pay in all the countries where they do business reinvested back into the public, because indeed it is the kind of offshoring of profits and the corporate tax evasion that is profoundly linked to the fragile social systems that we all so desperately need and that we collectively share in. I'll just leave it by saying, it seems sometimes impossible to take on big tech. I know many people feel overwhelmed. They're not necessarily sure where do we start, but I will remind us that we've taken on big cotton. We abolished the transatlantic slave trade. We abolished the institution of slavery. Yes, it took hundreds of years to do that, but we have to remain vigilant that we take a long view at the way in which these technologies are increasingly sorting us globally into haves and have-nots, and that those systems of sorting are becoming more and more opaque and more dangerous because they're harder and harder to intervene upon. We've taken on big tobacco, and of course, we still have work to do there, because when we took on big tobacco in the United States, what that did was open up new markets outside of the United States for big tobacco to work in an unregulated kind of environment. So we still have work to do, but there is work that has been done. And I would invite us to think more critically about the most harmful dimensions of technology and how we might take those on. My last thing I'll say here is we were promised that with more data and technology, we would have more freedom, we'd have more social equality, we would flatten inequality, everybody would be able to participate. But in fact, for every year that we've been tracking global wealth inequality, we see that we have more data and more technology come into the marketplace, come into governments, come into society. And since we've been tracking global wealth inequality and disparity, every year it increases. So the question is, how is it that we can have more data and technology and also have more social, political, and economic inequality and injustice to go with it? These are, to me, are the tough questions that I'm asking in my own research. And I just want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of these ideas with you today.
Muchísimas gracias, Safiya. Qué placer poder tenerte en esta casa. Te doy la bienvenida formal a estas terceras jornadas de comunicación estratégica organizada por la Universidad Nacional de Lomas de Zamora. Sin duda todavía tenemos mucho para aprender y mucho para hacer, para poder saldar o reducir de algún modo esta brecha de desigualdad con la que tenemos que también dar batalla las minorías, las mujeres en este entorno. Queda mucho por hacer. Me alegro que cada vez haya más investigadores, más investigadoras que estén tratando de dar solución a esta problemática. Nos quedamos sin tiempo, desde ya invitada para poder continuar estos debates, conocer un poco más en profundidad estas líneas de investigación y sobre todo para poder formar lo que nos interesa desde la universidad pública, sumar a la discusión sobre estos temas, comunicadores y comunicadoras con perspectiva de género y también conciencia sobre lo que implica estas nuevas tecnologías. Ahora sí, entonces los paso a invitar a todos y todas a que presencien nuestro panel Estos Somos Identidades Conurbanas, que comenzará en minutos nomás. Recuerden acceder con el link que se ha pasado previamente, ahora lo recordamos nuevamente por el chat. Panel que va a estar conformado por Josefina Nicolini, antropóloga y fotógrafa, actualmente colaboradora en el suplemento Las 12 de Página 12. Javier Aullero, profesor de Sociología de la Universidad de Texas, Austin, sus áreas de trabajo son la etnografía política, la pobreza humana y la acción colectiva. Gabriel Kessler, doctor en Sociología por la École des Hautes Études de Ciencias Sociales de París, investigador del CONICET, y Florencia Alcaraz, periodista, codirectora del LATFEM. Este panel, entonces, que da cierre a nuestras jornadas, va a estar moderado por Fernanda Berti, directora de la revista Cordón de nuestra Casa de Estudios. Muchas gracias nuevamente, Safiya. Continuaremos con estas discusiones, estos trabajos. Muchas gracias a todos y todas por haber sido parte de este encuentro. Disculpas nuevamente por las cuestiones técnicas que tuvimos al inicio. Agradecer a todos los docentes, los investigadores, las investigadoras, estudiantes que han participado entonces de esta charla. Jimé, te doy el pie a vos para poder hacer el cierre formal, ¿no? Pasamos directamente entonces al cierre general.
Los y las esperamos entonces en la sala, en la otra sala, porque tuvimos que, en la misma sala con la que estuvimos trabajando durante toda la semana. Así que los esperamos ahí para dar comienzo al panel final de las jornadas, que es el panel de conurbano, Estos somos, identidades conurbanas, y el cierre final y formal de las jornadas. Los esperamos ahí entonces.